we're going. When we're secure, we've got love, a healthy power, and play. But here are some of the aspects of what's going on whether we're in conflict or not conflict. Actually, we've got the ABCs. So we've got the affect, the feelings. So there might be anger or fear, right? Lots of different kinds of feelings go with conflict. The body-brain behavior, which you got the B, so you guys were touching on that. So when the brain or in the physiology, you've got adrenaline going, you've got the fight or flight that goes with that. So you've got the body and behavioral responses that go with that. And then you've got the cognition, the thoughts. So I don't think we mentioned that. But what do you tend to think when you're in conflict? Where are your thoughts going?
Got to get out of here.
Got to get out of here, okay. Guess who left who when we broke up?
That's disputed.
That's disputed, actually. Any other kinds of thoughts you tend to have in conflict? One of the things that tends to, did you
feel very mean?
Feel mean, right. We tend to go into blame. It's often like an outside because we're in a sense of threat response. Did you start to put a hand up? We're waving away a bug. So we're in a sense of threat response. So we're very alert to what's going on around us that might be a threat to us, and it seems like whatever's at fault is out there. So we tend to blame the environment and the world and don't feel safe in it. Now it's also possible, of course, to get into self-blame, so that happens as well. But we tend to be, our vision literally narrows. There's been research on this from positive psychologists about when you're in a positive state of mind, a state that feels good, your visual field literally expands and you take more in. You're aware of much more of what's going on. When you're in a fight, flight, or sort of negatively experienced state of mind, you tend to get very narrowly focused on whatever it is that you perceive the threat to be, or else wherever it is you think that the path away is. So your attention gets very narrowed. And that actually happens testably, physiologically, and it goes with the chemicals. So it's a whole body and behavior and emotional and thought response when we're in that threat response state that is very primal. And what happens when we're in that state and we're blaming somebody else? What happens in their physiology, do you think?
Same.
They get defensive, exactly, same thing. So we have mirror neurons that they can pick up on. There's a little literal measurable physiology to it, but also it's an experience of emotional contagion where we're in that state and that person tends to get into that state too. And that was survival based, in animals and early humans too. Like in an environment where there's a predator and one animal notices it and gets responsive to the predator and starts to either fight or flee, then it's adaptive if the others notice that and respond to that and get escalated too and either join the fight or run away.
Right.
So the emotional contagion is a natural and automatic experience. So it becomes an escalation. I'm just going to see if I can find another one of these. All right. I'll take a little detour and talk about this. What is it, you guys, that you would say escalates the conflict? So if you're with somebody and this kind of dynamic is happening, what feels like, you guys are all experts in some way, right? You've all been there? Right? So what are the kinds of things, if you don't want to talk about what you do, talk about what they do. What are the kinds of things that they do that escalates a conflict?
I don't do this, but closed-mindedness.
Closed-mindedness, yeah, them, of course. Raise your voice, exactly. Anybody else got something?
Like come closer and invade your space.
Invade your space, so boundaries, right?
Get dismissive,
right? So all of these things tend to escalate. So we're quite familiar then with the conflict escalator, what makes things worse. And eventually you get up to the top and your behaviors, as you're escalating each other, it's a vicious cycle. It's like a rising cycle. So as you get up to the top, the behaviors tend to get more and more extreme until you get, who knows, nuclear war, right? Or your own personal nuclear war in your household. So then the question becomes, what helps you de-escalate? And I'm gonna take a minute before we get there. See how I've got this organized. Okay, I've got a couple more to go through. So we talked about. I'm trying to keep things in a flow, but kind of detouring a little when it fits the thing. So I hope it's working okay for you guys. It feels like okay, good. All right. So so when we get into fight, flight, well, these are instinctive reactions, as I talk about, and they're threat response reactions. They're in a very primal parts of the brain, and so they're very automatic and they're very quick. In fact, some of them happen before you're consciously aware of them. Like, have you ever had that experience? Like, you're sort of running or yelling or, you're reacting before you even quite have realized that that's what you're doing. Some of you are nodding. So it's like, it's that quick because it's that survival based. So fight, you might have a grr kind of reaction. You might have an angry kind of feeling. Flight is physiologically somewhat similar. You're getting the energy and the blood going to the muscles. But in this case, you're running away, so you're in the yikes kind of state. And this is more of a, like, fight is more of a predator kind of response, and flight is more of a victim or prey kind of response. Freeze, you might get very quiet. Has anybody ever seen, I saw one recently, a rabbit in a freeze state. Has anybody ever seen an animal in that state? It was really striking to me. Yeah, a few of you. It's like they're just still. There's just like the expression deer in the headlights, right? It's like they're just, although unfortunately I haven't experienced that with deer, but, or fortunately, but yeah, so it's like, it's actually inside. How many of you have experienced that inside yourself, actually? That kind of like frozen, yeah, some of you like know what that is inside. Like inside, you're not calm. It's not like quiet inside. You're kind of probably a bit hypervigilant.
Is that sort of related to being completely numb, do you think? Or like being numb to your emotions, or is that something different?
It's a version of numb. It can be a version of numb, but it also can be a version of heightened awareness.
Right.
So there are different ways that it can manifest. But on the outside, whoever said like tight and restricted breathing, on the outside, you're very immobile. And then there's a third instinctive reaction that is, I was realizing I found an F for it, although I haven't seen it used anywhere. Maybe I can coin that one as a fall, which is submit, which is a slightly different and yet very instinctive mammalian kind of response. Has anybody seen, say, dogs together, where one is dominant and another one is submissive? Like, I just saw that the other day, and it was great. I didn't know these dogs, and I think they knew each other, but I was just seeing them for the first time, and there happened to be a bigger and smaller one, but that doesn't have to be a size-based thing. And the bigger one came over, and the small one immediately was like, "Don't hurt me! I'm just, you can have my stomach, you can have my throat, but don't hurt me. I'm no threat to you." So communicates no threat, and in that dominant order of dominance and submission, where that's easily established, and one animal just says, "Okay, you're in charge. I'm vulnerable. I won't hurt you." That's actually, it's what's mammalian level primal, not reptilian, but it actually avoids the conflict. So instead of escalating it, it de-escalates the conflict. But you may or may not want to be that submissive, But it is a tactic, a survival tactic, a mammalian survival tactic, that's an immediate reaction. So, having taken that little diversion, well, again, I just want to ask, I've asked you similar questions, but it helps me sort of stay connected to where you are. Like, how many folks are relating to what I'm saying so far? Are you feeling like it's sort of connecting? So, thank you. That helps me. And I invite you to think about questions if you want to ask. I'm happy to engage questions, and you can also let me know anytime as I go. But if you have a particular situation that you want to apply some of this to have that in mind might be beneficial for you, of course. So I have at the bottom here, emotional flooding and amygdala hijack. So when these, particularly the top three, are happening, I'll adjust this in a second if it's distracting. But when the top three are happening, it's literally measurable in an fMRI, a functional MRI machine, that you're getting more oxygenated blood to the more primitive parts of the brain. Specifically, the amygdala is one of them, where that tends to be thought of in a simplistic brain science kind of way as the basis for where these things are happening. So you literally are getting more oxygenated blood there, and now we'll get back to what happens when you're in that state. And you're getting what's called emotionally flooded, which is, I like it as a term because it's kind of so intuitive what it means. Emotionally flooded. You guys relate to that, to what that is? Yeah, it's like when you're just taken over. When you're just taken over, and that's all you see. So when you're emotionally flooded, what's happening is this is like over time going here. The feelings are this top line. So you might be just going along, and then something happens. Maybe it's an accumulation. Maybe it's a thing that we've thought about a million times, but we've managed to bury it, and then something happens that triggers it. So maybe it's got, in a way, a historical slow build.
But yeah.
But, what?
Sorry, I just had a comment, but yeah.
You had a comment about a time we did that?
No.
You have to
Keep going.
interrupt again.
You always scold me when I interrupt. How dare you?
What's your comment?
I just remember this is the Gottman research. It's actually research with thousands of couples, like scientifically. So it's very science based.
Yes,
Which is
exactly.
interesting, yeah.
This is Gottman and others. It's been substantiated in a lot of different places. Whoops. You're going along, and when that trigger happens, it may be a very sudden rise. It may be a very sudden, like the adrenaline shoots like that, and you're reacting, as we talked about before. And you may get quite escalated. And coming down again, conversely, takes a much longer time. Because you want to react right away to that bear in the woods kind of thing. Well, that's maybe not the best example here because I don't want you guys to be too scared of bears because they're okay. But here, but you want to react quickly to the threat. Coming down from the reaction doesn't. You need to sort of make sure that it's gone. So it takes a much longer time for the body to come down from the threat. And the sort of standard study measurement is that it takes about 20 minutes. That's what he's going to say. It takes about 20 minutes if the threat has totally stopped for the body chemistry to settle down again, like a minimum of 20 minutes. But how often, interpersonally, does the threat totally stop? Right? Because you're still probably talking to that person, or if you're not talking to them, or yelling at them, or they're yelling at you, or you see the thing that the fight was about. Or, barring all that, you're walking away and you're muttering to yourself. So you're keeping it going because your thoughts are in that cycle, and then it keeps going. It's not your fault your thoughts are in that cycle. It's part of how this cycle works. But it keeps it going. So 20 minutes is like the minimum under ideal circumstances.
I mean, that was my comment because that was much longer than I thought. The common sense view is like it's 5 minutes and you're calm again, but actually it's at least 20 minutes. That was a revelation to me. I found that very useful to know.
Yeah, count to 10 is a good start, but it might help you interrupt the cycle of where you're going. So it's a good start, but it's not where you ultimately want to get, probably. So there was a time when Francis and I, this is a long time ago, and I think you don't remember it anymore, I've asked you, but I've told the story a few times, so I remember it, at least my version of it. We were in a restaurant many years ago. I don't think we were even living together yet. So, long time ago. And I don't remember, and I quickly forgot at the time, actually, what the fight was about. It's just that I remember that we were there, and something happened that was like this huge trigger for Francis specifically. And he stood up, and it was one of those restaurant scenes, where somebody stands up and goes, "I'm out of here," and the other person goes, "I hope nobody's watching," and he stormed out.
I remember that. I remember storming out. I don't remember what it was about at all. I do remember storming out.
So he stormed out. Now, I was lucky in that I was already starting in this field, and I'd recently been reading about emotional flooding. probably had good reason, right? I did something terrible. Right?
Very good reason.
So I'd recently been reading about emotional flooding, and what do you think but however, that part aside that I've been reading about, what do you think my immediate reaction was?
Flooded.
I was flooded, exactly. What do you think I wanted to do?
Yell at him.
I wanted to yell at him. I was wanting to like storm after him and say, "You can't walk out on me like that." And then we would have had it out in the street, maybe. Somebody would have to figure out the bill. And, who knows where we would have been. And I was just that lucky that as I had that impulse, some little piece of me had the thought, like that little bit of blood that was in my thinking brain kind of went, flooded, flooded. And I realized that he was flooded. And so coming after him at that moment was going to be like trying to engage with him when he was way up here. Now, this bottom line, by the way, is the thinking brain. So he's up here emotionally, and he's down here in terms of his capacity for rational thought. So, like, if I'd stormed after him, I would have been engaging with him here. And not only that, since I was flooded, I would have been there too. And so we would have gone in that cycle. And that's often, like I see that in the parents that I'm dealing with in custody visitation cases. That's where they end up making major decisions in that moment because they're so upset, right? They're like, you can never see our son again. And then the other person's reacting to that, and then they're in court, and then it's like it's a whole thing. Because they've reacted right there because they're trying to defend themselves because it feels like, they're either defending themselves or defending their child, and it feels like a survival thing. So, and they don't have this concept. So just the concept is really useful because I thought to myself, he's flooded, I'm flooded. Chasing after him right now is not the best idea. So I took a deep breath and I finished my meal and I paid the bill, and we weren't living together yet. So I left him alone for a couple days. And then 2 days later, by the time we talked about it, we didn't remember what it was about. Now usually we remember what it's about, so that's weird. I don't know what it was, but it must have been something with the cutlery in the restaurant. Who the heck knows? There was something that triggered something. And here we are.
I can remember one aspect, just the emotion of I felt humiliated by something.
Oh, that's interesting.
Humiliated,
right. So
yeah.
Shame is a huge driver, and I wasn't going to talk about that actually, but it's easy to make an interesting point about that. James Gilligan, if you've heard of Carol Gilligan, this is her husband, is a psychiatrist, I think it is, who used to be the head of a prison, of a maximum security prison. And he actually interviewed a whole bunch of men in the prison, it was a men's prison, who had killed people, and who admitted it, who they weren't saying, no, I'm innocent, it wasn't me. They'd actually said, yes, I killed the guy. And he interviewed them and said, well, why? And the vast majority said some version of, well, he dissed me. So his conclusion was that shame, and actually others have concluded that too, there's a lot of work on that interethnically, internationally, like the humiliation, being put down in that way, is a huge driver of it feels like survival, I have to defend my identity. And so, if those are your tools that are available, the gun is there or whatever, right? That might be how you defend your identity. So you reclaim your power that way. So thank you for only walking out. So that's emotional flooding, and that's the concept of that. And there is some research, and there's a bunch of gender-based research on this, so I'll just touch on that a little bit. It's generalization, so it's not always true for you or your other person as an individual, but generally speaking, the way testosterone works in the body, it actually takes men much longer to come down.
Oh, right.
Yes.
I now remember the other bit of the Gottman research says that sort of stereotyping, but it's typical for men to actually avoid conflict because, one of the theories is it's because actually it takes them longer to come down. It's so unpleasant to get flooded that men don't really want to get into arguments.
Right. It tends to be extreme. It's like you go to the violence end or you go to the walking out end.
I mean, they do get into arguments, but there's a lot of avoidance. So that kind of made sense to me as well. But
yeah. So that's actually, let me ask you guys this. So I don't have a chart for this, but if you think about whether you tend to do, well, some of them touch on it. They're not up here now, but whether you tend to go in your sort of automatic response, is it more common for you to go to fight or flight or freeze or something else? Submit maybe? Like, how many of you, like, that's your gut reaction? It's like, he dissed me, I gotta stand up for myself. The inner warrior's like right there, ready. Some of you are nodding. Great.
It's
Thanks.
yeah, definitely some of the time. Yeah.
Yeah, and it could be that you go to a bunch of them too. And how many of you go to flight? You go to like, I'm out of here, forget it. Stop talking about it. Thank you.
That it seems like more in private, like
In
with
private,
you, that
so
I
in
want to
different
get
settings,
in
or
public.
work versus home, you
maybe.
might go
I don't
different
know.
places.
I don't know.
How
But,
many of you go to freeze? Some version of like, you know, particularly if you have a history of trauma, this can be kind of common. You know, like you just go to like, I can't do anything. I just have to try to. Hopefully, nothing else happens. Yeah. So some of you relate to that. Anybody go to a version of submit, i.e., whatever you say, which can be great. Thank you. Yes. So it can be. I mean, it can be a good thing to do any of these things. By the way, they're survival, so they all have their place.
I didn't hear what he said.
Oh, what'd you say?
I said he's lying.
You wish you would, right?
What did you say though? I didn't hear what you
So
said.
you put your hand up, then it goes to submit. Well, this is also an interesting thing, and actually our relationship is a good example of that too. We often have both felt like we were the ones giving in too much. Like, no, I give in all the time, and he's like, no, I give in all the time. And then we have a fight about that.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah.
But submit can be constructive. It can, I mean, and it also can be genuinely willing. Like maybe you just don't care that much about that issue, and you want the other person to be happy, and they feel strongly about it, and you're like, okay, honey, let's do that. You know. But it can also be either codependent and repetitive in a kind of stuck way, or it can be victim. Like I have no choice but to submit, so I'm going to do that because that's the only way I'm going to be safe. So there are lots of different ways it can play out. And how many of you go quickly to some version of let's work this out together? Like we've got to talk this through. Is anybody like that? Right. Yeah. So one of the, I mean, that can be great. There are obviously plus sides to that. Are there any downsides you see to that? Yes.
If they're flooded, you have to solve it right now.
That's
Yeah.
perfect. Thank you. I in my classes, I've also taught at university, and so we have more time. But in my classes, I'll have people do a little survey and really think about like how do you tend to respond? And I'll have people be in groups, and they get to talk to each other about their preferred mode of response and what are the strengths and pros and cons. And we'll have people in the avoid corner, because that's a common, like some people just want to avoid conflict or just stay away from it, like whatever that takes, right? So we'll have those people usually in a corner. They've gone over there, and they'll be talking about how sometimes it's just better to let things die down. Like we did in that 2-day thing, that the 2 days when we were flooded, like it died down, and it actually, in that case, it was kind of gone, right? Sometimes it's better to do that. So they talked about that. And the people in the cooperate center of the room said, no, you have to talk about things. And they said, no, we don't want to talk about things. And they backed up a little. And the people in the cooperate said, no, we got to talk it through. And it was really fascinating. I've seen that repeatedly, because the cooperate people are like, you know, we've matured enough that we have this right way to do it. And the avoid people just want to be given space. Otherwise, they get more flooded. And so one of the things we do at that point, like what Gottman recommends, is that we have a strategy called postpone. So, you know, it takes a little working out, like some capacity to communicate about it maybe when you're not in the middle of it, to be able to say,
Right.
I just need space sometimes. I just need to settle down. Remember that emotionally flooding chart? I just need time. And for me, it might take a few days or whatever it takes. I need to go out in nature. And then we can talk about it later. And I will come back to talk about it because I know, honey, you need to talk about it. I know that's important that we talk about this. And I promise I'll try not to get flooded. Let's have a careful conversation how we do it so I can have breaks and whatever, right? But I am going to come back to it. So your desire to process it through is also met.
So if you remember,
If you remember. If you don't remember, maybe it's over.
Right.
Oh, if you remember the issue that we, yeah,
Yeah, all right. Right.
right. If he did remember the issue, we'd probably just get into a
Get
fight.
straight
So
into
just
it,
leave
yeah.
there.
That's, it's better we don't, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it can be, and then there are obviously issues that are so challenging to talk about that even if you start off calm, you know, that's why I have a job as a mediator.
so that's why I never postpone.
Yeah, and some people have that philosophy, like don't go to sleep angry, like deal with it now,
I never postpone.
which works. Oh,
Yeah.
that makes sense. Is that what you do? You deal with it like that day. How do people around you feel about that?
I don't know.
You don't know. Okay. Because for some people that would be great, and for other people that would be like, that would be hard. Because they just want the break. Yeah. So, what was I going to say about that? Oh, yeah. So there are people who have that philosophy of like, don't go to bed angry, and then there are other people who have the philosophy of take a break and sleep on it. So what Gottman found, he did a very simplistic division of personal styles, and he said there's volatile, you know, obviously the volatile style, there's avoidant, and then there's validating. And he did some research, and he asked people what they predicted, and what do you guys predict? Like if you have a couple,
Well,
so a couple that on the whole is volatile versus a couple that's avoidant, or a couple that's validating.
can you
Which
explain
do you-
validating a bit more?
Okay, thank you. So validating is like this person was talking about, like where you cooperate. You go right to cooperation. You want to talk it through, and you sort of, you know, you have the sort of mature version of you listen to the other person and you express yourself and you try to understand their point of view. So that's validating. So which couples do you think are likely to last longest? Who would think it's the volatile couples? In this crowd, oh, you do? Great, thank you. Yes, in my classes at John Jay, when I teach in the city, which is a bunch of like inner city sort of survived on the street kinds of folks, they're like the volatile. Right? Why do you say that?
I don't know. I feel like I have a bias towards like it's passionate and you work it out.
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
That's not true.
Thank you. Well, that's what they say too. It's like you get it out.
It's all out
You
in the
don't
open,
hold it
yeah,
in.
right.
It's on the table. You know where they stand. That's a good point. How many of you think it's the avoidant couples who just say, let's just keep things calm and nice and, you know, everything's going to be all right? Nobody. How many of you think it's the validating couples? So more of those. So he thought it was going to be the validating couples, and it turned out that it was actually the couples who were matched. Like if you're both volatile, I mean, leaving aside, by the way, like violence. Like we're just going to leave that aside for the purpose of this conversation. But you know, when it's just like get it out on the table, and I worked with a couple like that. I had to leave. I was working for them, and they ran a business together, and they were yelling at each other all the time, and I couldn't take it. But every time I talked to them about it, they said we're fine. That's how we are. So that can work if you're on the same page. Validating can work if you're on the same page. Avoidant can work, but it tends to get drift apart because you're not dealing with things.
Oh, really?
So it can work, but it tends to over time become like a passionless marriage or whatever, right? It's just like you're not dealing with things.
So what happens when you have one of each?
That doesn't tend to work so well because you've got to somehow find a way, like I was talking about, remember with the avoidant and the cooperating people, you've got to find a way that meets both your needs,
I mean,
which is not always so easy.
Right.
But over time, if you can find that, then those can be quite stable too. But you have to find something that everybody feels like they can work with. Otherwise, they don't tend to last. Does that speak to your experience?
Yes.
Yeah.
right, so it's kind of not hopeless, but you have to work harder at it.
Yeah. Now
Yeah,
the other
right.
thing, this is a good time to mention this other thing that he said, which is, I think I have, it's over here. He talked about the bottom of this here He's got a lot of good stuff, by the way, John Gottman, if you're interested in his. He's got a lot of books written for just, like you and me, to read and understand about his research. And he did it, which he did with his wife, by the way. But one of the things he talks about is having the emotional bank account for secure attachment. So it's like, when you get into that conflict, you've had a lot of good experiences together, so you have some reserve in a way that can kind of pad some of the stress. And in specific, he found in his research that if there's a balance of equal intensity, so it's not like one is really strong and one's tiny, but equal intensity, 5 positive to 1 negative interactions in the relationship, that's highly predictive of people staying together for years and being happy. Self-reported happiness, years down the road. If it's 5 to 1, whatever their conflict styles are, and if they work out different styles or whatever it is, if it's 5 positive to 1 negative, again, assuming that the 5 positive are not like, hi sweetie, and the 1 negative is not like screaming and yelling, right? Assuming it's about equal intensity, that builds your emotional bank account such that you can weather that negative until you can come and either work it out or agree to let it slide or whatever it is. So Frances and I actually had an experience directly with this too, when we'd been doing my reading, and we had broken up at some early point again, and we had shared circles, and so we were at a shared event, and we were talking to each other.
I don't know what's coming, so yeah.
So you didn't remember. We were at a shared event. We were at we were at a shared event, and we were sitting next to each other talking because we were trying to sort of still be friends. And we started talking about this, and people were trying to get us back together because they were like, "Oh, you're such a good couple," whatever. Right? So we started talking about this, and we realized that one of the things we could do if we did want to get back together was build the 5. So we started to consciously do that. We started to consciously say, how do we build the emotional bank account so that we have more of the positives? And that actually, well, here we are. But don't forget it, okay? Like, it's really important. Anyway.
We converted it into this thing, so if somebody said something nasty, it's like, right, now you owe me 5.
Right. We made a lot of games out of conflict, which is, by the way, one of the things that when you're really in fight-flight, you're not much in a joking mode, right? At that moment, the other person tries to joke with you, and even if they're not being snide and sarcastic and they're really trying to joke, you're probably going to take it like they're being snide and sarcastic, and it's probably going to escalate you. So you got to be super careful with humor, because when you're in fight or flight, you're not in that play mode. But when you can shift to play, if you can shift it, then actual playing, can help bring you more into the safety and connection, and more out of the fight-flight. It actually helps your body chemistry rebalance towards the connection hormones. So, okay. So, this is probably a good moment to ask. Anybody, any questions, comments?
I was wondering if you have a take on the difference between healthy expressions of fighting and unhealthy expressions.
In the field, we tend to call that constructive conflict versus destructive conflict. I think does that sound like what you're talking about? Right? Like fighting the good fight? Yeah. Well, let me ask what you have thoughts about it? Because I can say something, but you're obviously thinking about it, so then probably that's not going to work, because they're going to want to go into the same mode, because they're going to fight for survival, because you're going to be a threat. But both of these are trying to take away the threat so that you get to say what you have to say, but in a way that doesn't re-trigger their threat reactivation. Is that speaking to does that make sense? So the question is, wouldn't it be nice if they're the ones who do that? If they step out of the destructive conflict and they take responsibility and they say, it's because I really value our relationship so much. Wouldn't it be great if they did that and made it easier for us so they're not threatening us? But the problem is, what we say in our trainings is They're not here. You're the ones who are here. Right? You don't have control that they do that unless you can find a way to start to do it in yourself first, and then you bring that and help them learn that, because otherwise you don't know if they're going to do that. And if you're not one of you able to do it, or go to a mediator, or have some other family members or whatever you do that helps resolve it in a good way, it's probably going to just keep happening in a way that may or may not serve your life, right? So you need to find a way to help that move to constructive conflict. Is that speaking to your question? You look thoughtful.
I think about these things a lot. I was a teacher. I am a teacher.
Yeah. So with the kids, exactly. I want to hear your question. 20% that end up not resolved, and we hope not worse, but like in a court context, then they would, like, for example, when I mediate custody visitation, I have to admit, I do better than 80%, but when I mediate, I put you can probably tell, like, I care about this. I'm actually quite under the weather right now, but I've got pumped up to do this. So, like, I put my heart and soul into the mediation, and I do pretty well. But if it doesn't resolve, they're just back in front of the judge in that context. So it depends a lot on the context and what's going on. But does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank
Yeah.
you. It's more personal experience, right?
It's more of a person. Well, it depends. Like in the court, I have to produce an agreement that they both agree to, that the judge says yes, that solves it for the child, and the judge signs off. So that's actually court validated. But other times it's like, do they feel? They have to agree. So it's personal in that way. They have to say, yeah, that's good enough. But other times it's just like personally. Like how many? I mean, another statistic we could look at is divorces, right? Which is pretty high. I don't know, the current divorce rate is still 50% maybe?
Somewhere around there, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, those of us in the field wish that there was more of this education much earlier on, and more of a cultural climate where people could admit, like, yeah, we're having this trouble. How can, people around us support us in finding a way to figure it out, so that if we decide to get divorced, it's not from, I hate you. It's from, yeah, we've just really realized that, I have these dreams and you have those dreams, and it's been good, but let's separate. Like, that would be what we would love in this field. But it's often, and that's why, by the way, I I didn't tell you that part about my background. I mean, my parents were divorced, and back then there wasn't mediation in the courts, and they fought like tooth and nails and never resolved things before they died. So they were still fighting 50 years after they got divorced, and to the extent that they had any interaction at all, which was basically not. But I went through that as a child, having to go in front of the judge, and the judge asking me at 7 years old what I wanted, and I mean, it was awful. Yeah, right. It was awful. And so that's one of the reasons I did the family court mediation, because I really don't want children to have to do that. Like, I really see, like, if they could just talk it out. And it's probably why I put my heart into it so much, that the parents could just talk it out. Even if they don't agree on 99% of things, but if they can agree on a safe, sane way to help the child go back and forth between them, they can just agree on that, let's do that. So, I'm getting a little distracted, but that speaks to what you're asking, right?
Just one thing about the 7-year-old when you were 7, and are those testimonies from those audiences are still taken?
Do they still do that?
Oh, do they still do that? That now what they do is they have an attorney for the child. And the attorney for the child talks to the child confidentially. It's hard to set it up, but ideally it's confidential. And then the attorney for the child represents the child in court. And it depends on the state whether they represent what they think is the child's best interest, or whether they literally represent what the child said. In New York State, they're supposed to say what the child wants. But
how
it's
how old they have to be? Even 7 years old?
7 years old.
And
Yeah.
have choose to which parent is going to stay?
Well, the attorney for the child talks to the child and says, "What do you want?" And the child says, and then the attorney says that in the court. The judge decides. The judge is still saying, well, the child says he wants to be with his mother, but it seems like maybe, he doesn't really understand the process. So the judge still makes the decision. But the attorney for the child says what the child says.
Right.
Is that
Their child.
is that answering your questions?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So I also do this work now outside of court. My work has changed a lot over the last years, and obviously through the pandemic and whatever. I love when cases don't get to court, or I can help them stay out of court. And I've had friends in the past who were divorce mediators. I haven't mediated divorce, which is slightly different because it has a whole other legal end of it. But I've had friends who were divorce mediators who would have people come to them for divorces, and some fairly high percentage of those people would end up not divorcing after meeting with the mediator and realizing, oh, it was this thing that we've never been able to talk through. And now that we've been able to talk it through with the help of somebody really well trained to do that, like, maybe we don't need to divorce anymore. I mean, it wasn't most of the cases, but it was maybe, I think it was a quarter or a third of their cases, like more than you would have expected, because the mediator helped them not be in this mode anymore and helped them actually get their problem-solving mind back on board. All right, so let me see where else to go. I do want to mention, let's see, do I want to mention?
Got a question?
Yeah, I think I do want to mention. Okay, so as I said, I'm not feeling great. This is more energy that I've put out in weeks, literally. I didn't expect to stand up. I didn't expect to have this much voice today, but I'm in my mode of this is, like, I love doing this. And I really appreciate how many of you have decided that, this is engaging enough, or maybe I'm just too loud to let you do anything else, but I appreciate the interest and engagement. It's one of the things I love about this work, actually. When I've done corporate trainings, people have come up to me and said, you did that listening training thing this morning, and I realized I really listened at work really well, when I disagree with my colleagues. But over lunch, I called my wife and I said, honey, someone literally said this to me in one of my first trainings. I called my wife and I said, honey, you know what I realized this morning in my training? I don't listen to you. And she said to me, thank God you finally realized that.
That's really good.
So he came up to me after lunch and told me that, and for me, that was much better than what they do in the court. Like, they figure out to talk to their colleagues. That's good, but that was great. So I come into my element, but what I have, and you may have an emotional reaction. I don't know, and I have a little emotional reaction to saying it. I have long COVID, which for many of us who have long COVID turns into chronic fatigue, which is what I actually am dealing with right now. I'm not at all contagious. I don't have COVID. It was a year and a half ago, or almost, that I had COVID. But I am profoundly fatigued, actually, and I have up and down days. I should probably sit, but I'll keep going. Because I made a decision. Like, I'm going to come here, I'm going to do this. I love this. I love supporting the people who, this cafe. And, I don't have anything scheduled. So if I just need to rest later, and who knows, I had more energy the last couple days than I've had in a long time, and maybe it's because I'm getting back to myself and I was thinking about being my professional self. So,
did you have
every now and then I'm pausing here and I'm going, like my mind is sort of like, wait, where am I going?
There may have been a question here, no? Yeah.
I do, but you finish what you say. I have a question.
Well, I was reflecting whether to bring that up about the long COVID, because it's like, how many of you have had some feelings about the pandemic and about and about having to stay home or wear masks, or they're not wearing masks, or they should be wearing masks, or I don't want to wear a mask, or like whatever it is. Like, how many of you have had some kind of reaction about like feeling conflictual around how people handle the pandemic? Like, you're nodding. People don't even want to put their hands up, which I understand. Right? Like, it's not been so easy out there and in here. So I wasn't even sure whether to bring it up. I mean, some people are like, COVID isn't a thing. And, you know, like there's so many different perspectives. And as a conflict resolver, I'm actually interested in all different perspectives. Like, I kind of want to hear you. But on the other hand, I'm super cautious. Like, when I'm vaccinated and when I'm out, I have a mask on. Like, I do what I can that I understand is to be best because I'm cautious. I mean, right now you're all far enough away, but I'll put my mask on again later. So,
Thank you, that was very nice.
oh,
We had to go, but it was really
oh, good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. If it
That's a
feels
card.
like, yeah, I made myself some business cards. So if it feels like you want to tell people, or you know, you want to be in touch, feel free. Or look at my website. You're welcome. I should put these somewhere else, having just talked about.
Yeah.
social
Put them out.
distancing.
Well, that's all right. Well,
Thank you. So, all right. So, I want to go on a little bit so I can wrap up with sort of what I felt like was the key takeaways I want you guys to be able to have from today. But you had a question. Yes.
Oh, me, yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess I wonder, you know, some people when they're angry get so wrapped up in anger that they might not even realize they're angry, right? So, and they react from there. Other people have a little bit more space and
Yeah.
see their anger, and so I'm curious what you recommend for people to really recognize, like right in the heat of the moment. What are some things that you tell people, especially for ones that maybe don't have as much space, to recognize that they're in that peak, right?
Yeah, in the moment is when you absolutely want it and when it's absolutely the hardest time. Especially if the other person is mad at you. And they're like, whatever you say is going to feed into it.
Yeah.
So what I say is two things. One is you got to really pay attention to your self-awareness. Like, where are you coming from and wanting them to change? And in general, right? And then secondly, you got to build that emotional bank account at other moments so that you develop your communication at other moments. And you can develop things like for a long time, we haven't needed it so much lately, but we do it sort of as needed. But for a long time, I think every week we had to sit down like, this is our time to talk through anything that's on our minds, and we had a structure. There are structured ways to do that, like exchange listening. And you sit on your own. We had this little world, and we had a heart. I don't have the heart anymore, but one of us would sit on our world. We put the heart between us and listen to the other person's world.
I see. Got it.
Right? And then we'd switch.
Got it.
So it's to be able to learn how to say in that moment, because you've talked about other times, right? Oh, we're flooded. Let's postpone. And maybe in 3 days we'll have a dinner and we'll do, you know, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you have to build the foundation.
Got it. Okay.
And you hope that they're on board and they want to cooperate and look at their own side. And if they're not, you've got to make some decisions.
Yeah.
All right, so this has been fun. I'm really glad you guys enjoyed it. Let me see what else I had that I already prepared. Oh, conflict de-escalator. All right, we'll look at that in a second. Look at that. Oh, all right, okay. So moving towards wrapping up, what de-escalates conflict? I mean, we've been
Say it
touching
again.
on it, but I'm just going to ask it as a more
Say it again.
organized question at the moment.
say it again. I don't. Sure.
What de-escalates conflict?
time.
Time. Yeah, like we talked about that. Like you come off the emotional flooding, and sometimes just you get a little more perspective. Because remember I talked about like your perspective is very narrow when you're highly stressed. So you take a little time and you come off the flooding and your perspective widens. And you go, yeah, I'm really upset about my brother about that thing. But you know, like this is my brother and whatever, right? Like maybe, like I don't know if you have a brother and maybe that's not the case, but sometimes you just get the broader perspective over time, and that is one thing that helps. What else helps? What helps you? Like you guys have been in conflicts, so you've been in conflicts that have resolved in some way probably, so what helps you? Come back.
Self-care.
Self-care. Nice. Like what kinds of self-care?
Meditating, walking, yoga,
Yeah.
baths.
Agreed. Like all those things that bring you back into yourself so that you know you're okay and help remind you that you're safe. Because usually the objective reality, like again, we're going to leave aside actual brutal violence at this point and so on. But usually the objective reality is that you're safe. Like in this moment, we're all fundamentally safe. So finding ways for our system to remember that and recognize that.
Sorry. Desire for resolution and words of love.
Nice. Right. So building on what you had said before. So desire for resolution inside yourself and expressing that in a loving way, which again helps the other person come back into that state also. Yeah. So coming back into safety and helping them come back into safety. And all the various tools for that, like listening to them, perhaps, if you can, without getting activated yourself. So trying to understand where they're coming from. I think I have a thing about this.